The moment that broke something open in me wasn't loud. It was the sound of my brother's chair scraping back across the conference room floor as he reached across the table and slid the envelope toward me. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Not a check, not a deed. A letter from my grandmother's estate attorney explaining that, per her verbal wishes as interpreted by my brother who had served as her primary caregiver, the bakery, the house on Callaway Street, and the savings account totaling just over $400,000 would transfer entirely to him. I received her apron, the one she wore every morning for 30 years. My brother smiled when I unfolded the note. His wife reached over and touched his hand like they'd just won something. He looked at me across the table and said, "She always said you were the independent one. Figured you wouldn't need it." His wife nodded. "You've always been so capable, Claire. You'll be fine." No one else in the room said a word. I pressed my palms flat against the table and kept my face still. I had learned that from my grandmother. Her name was Ruth, and she had run a small bakery in our town since before I was born. The kind of place where people ordered the same thing every week, and she remembered it without writing it down. She knew which regulars took their coffee black, which ones needed an extra minute before they were ready to talk, which children liked their muffins split open with butter inside. The bakery smelled like brown sugar and warm flour year-round, and in winter, when the front windows fogged from the heat of the ovens, it felt like the only fully honest place I had ever been. I spent every Saturday there from the time I was 7, not because my parents brought me, but because I asked to go. My mother would drop me at the back entrance before 8 in the morning, and my grandmother would hand me an apron without ceremony, just a small nod and a quiet "wash your hands first." I learned to measure and fold and proof and wait. She was unhurried in a way that felt deliberate, like she had decided long ago that patience wasn't a limitation but a tool. When I got something wrong, she didn't raise her voice. She just showed me again, slower, her hands guiding mine. My brother was 11 years older than me. By the time I was old enough to understand the shape of our family, he was already gone college, then a city job, then a marriage to a woman named Deanna who wore her opinions like jewelry, always visible, always catching the light. They moved back to town 6 years ago, after my grandmother's first health scare. A minor cardiac event, the doctors said. Nothing life-altering, but my brother arrived within the week, and he never really left. He called it devotion. He was always talking about devotion. I called it proximity. My grandmother never said much about it. When I visited on weekends, she would pour coffee and ask about my work and listen with the full weight of her attention, the way she always had. Sometimes I noticed a new piece of furniture I didn't recognize, something too modern for her house. Sometimes a drawer I knew well was suddenly reorganized. Once I asked if she needed help going over her finances, because I worked in accounting and it would take me an afternoon, and she said gently but firmly, "Your brother handles that now." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at the window above the sink, the way she did when she was thinking about something she hadn't decided how to say yet. I let it go. I shouldn't have. The last real conversation I had with her alone was 3 months before she died. She was having a good day, moving through her kitchen without the slowness that had crept into her walk over the past year. She made 2 cups of tea without being asked and set mine in front of me before I sat down. Then she looked at me with the same steady calm she brought to everything and said, "I want you to know something, and I want you to remember it exactly." I told her I was listening. She said, "Everything I built was built honestly. I need you to hold on to that." I didn't know what she meant. I thought it was something philosophical, the kind of thing people say when they're getting older and want to feel like their life added up to something clean. I told her, of course, and she nodded, and then she changed the subject to the new recipe she was testing, a cardamom loaf she thought might work for the holiday season. She passed 11 weeks later, quietly in her sleep the way people who spent their whole lives doing things the right way sometimes get to go. The reading happened 2 weeks after the funeral. I drove myself to the attorney's office, not expecting anything in particular. The bakery would go to someone who could run it. The house would probably be sold. Whatever savings she had accumulated over a lifetime of early mornings and flour-dusted aprons would be divided reasonably. That was the picture I had carried into that room. What I walked out with was an apron, and the knowledge that my brother had positioned himself so carefully over so many years that by the time my grandmother was gone, the paper trail pointed entirely in his direction. I drove back to my apartment with the apron folded on the passenger seat. I didn't cry. I made a pot of coffee and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, turning my grandmother's words over in my mind. Everything I built was built honestly. I need you to hold on to that. She hadn't been speaking philosophically. She had been giving me instructions. I called in sick the next 2 days and didn't leave my apartment. Not because I was grieving, though I was, but because I needed to think without interruption. I pulled out the notebook I used for work and started writing down everything I could remember. Every conversation, every odd detail, the reorganized drawers, the modern furniture, the way she'd looked at the window when she said my brother handles that now, the cardamom loaf she never got to finish testing. On the third morning, I drove to the bakery. My brother hadn't opened it since her death. The sign in the window said closed until further notice in his handwriting, which I recognized from years of birthday cards that arrived 3 days late. I had a key. I had always had a key. She gave it to me when I was 19 and told me if I ever needed a quiet place to think, the bakery would be there. I let myself in through the back. The kitchen smelled exactly as it always had. No one had changed anything. Her aprons hung on the hooks by the door, 3 of them in a row, worn thin at the front from years of wiping hands clean. Her recipe binder sat on the counter to the left of the mixer, tabbed and annotated in her careful handwriting. I stood there for a moment, with my hands in my coat pockets, and let myself feel the weight of everything she had built over 30 years, sitting quiet and waiting, as if she'd only stepped out. Then I went to the small office in the back corner. It was barely a room. A desk, a filing cabinet, a corkboard with delivery schedules pinned to it, and a narrow shelf above the window where she kept her ledgers. I had helped her set up an accounting system 5 years earlier, a simple spreadsheet structure she could manage herself, and I knew exactly how she organized her records. I pulled the current ledger from the shelf. It had been updated in my brother's handwriting for the past 2 years. I sat down and opened my laptop. I am an accountant. I have been an accountant for 8 years. I am not dramatic about this skill the way some people are dramatic about skills they use as weapons. It is simply what I know how to do. I look at numbers, I find where they don't agree with each other, and I follow the disagreement until it leads somewhere. Most of the time it leads to simple errors. Occasionally it leads to something else. Within 4 hours I had found the something else. The bakery's revenue had been documented accurately enough. But the expense reports for the past 22 months showed a pattern that was easy to miss if you weren't looking and impossible to unsee once you were. Payments to a supply vendor I didn't recognize. Recurring, always just under the threshold that would require additional documentation. When I searched the vendor name, it returned a registered business address that matched the street where my brother and Deanna had lived before they moved back to town. A business registered 14 months before my grandmother's first health scare. I wrote the name down. Then I went back further. There was a property services charge that appeared 18 months ago, a landscaping contract listed as a business expense, which would make no sense for a small downtown bakery, unless someone had decided to bill personal home maintenance through the business. The service address on the invoice, which my brother had filed neatly in the back folder, was his home address. I photographed every page. Then I searched the county property records and pulled up the deed history on the house on Callaway Street. My grandmother had owned it outright since 1991, but 14 months ago, a refinancing had been initiated. I found the bank records in the second drawer of the filing cabinet, tucked behind an outdated insurance policy. She had refinanced the house. $80,000 had been drawn out. The loan was in her name. But the withdrawal receipt, which she had apparently never seen because it had been mailed to a secondary address listed on the account, showed that the funds had been transferred to an account that wasn't hers. I sat back in the chair and looked at the wall for a long time. My grandmother had trusted him completely. She was sharp until very close to the end, but she hadn't grown up in a world where you assumed the people you loved were rerouting your savings through shell accounts. She would have signed things he put in front of her and believed the summary he gave her, because she had no reason not to, because he had shown up every day for 6 years with a concerned face and a ready explanation. Everything I built was built honestly. She had known. Not everything, maybe, but enough. Enough to know that something had been bent. Enough to look out the window instead of at me when she said certain things. Enough to want me to hold on to something she couldn't name directly because she didn't have the language for what had been done to her. But she had known I would. I left the bakery the same way I came in, through the back, and locked the door behind me. I went home and spent the rest of the week building a clean, organized file. Not a pile of suspicion. A documented record. Vendor registration dates cross-referenced with business expense dates. Property records. Loan paperwork. Bank transfer receipts. Everything labeled, dated, and sourced from documents that already existed in public record or in the bakery's own files, which I had every right to access as a named beneficiary of the estate. I did not call my brother. I did not send an accusatory email. I did not say a word to Deanna. I called an estate attorney. Not the one my brother had used for the will. A different one, a woman named Patricia, who had been recommended to me by a colleague and who, when I spread the documents across her conference table and walked her through them, looked at me for a long moment and then said, "How long did it take you to put this together?" I told her about a week. She looked back at the documents. "You should have been here sooner," she said, which I took as a compliment. She filed a formal contest of the estate distribution on my behalf, citing financial elder abuse and fraudulent misrepresentation of the decedent's wishes. She also flagged the refinancing for review by the State Financial Crimes Unit, which was a step I had not anticipated but did not object to. My brother called me 3 days later. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the effort behind it, the way you can hear someone holding a door closed against wind. He said he thought we should talk. I said I agreed and that he was welcome to have his attorney contact mine. He said, "Claire, this is family." I said, "I know. That's why I kept records." Then I told him I had to go, and I meant it because I did. The next 6 weeks were quiet on my end, and I gathered from Patricia, considerably less quiet on his. The estate was frozen pending review. The Financial Crimes Unit opened a preliminary inquiry. Deanna, according to Patricia's assistant, who seemed to have excellent peripheral information, was furious with my brother in a way that suggested this was not the first time his decisions had created complications. I went to work. I came home. I ran in the mornings along the route my grandmother used to drive to the bakery, past the corner where she always turned, past the coffee shop, where she bought her second cup on Thursdays, because she said her own always tasted better, but the walk did her good. I thought about her a lot, but not with the sharp, clenching quality that grief had in the first weeks. More like the feeling of carrying something that had weight but not burden. Like her carved fishing rod, if she'd had one. Like a tool pressed into the right hands. The resolution came on a Tuesday, which felt appropriately undramatic. Patricia called me in the afternoon with the summary. My brother had agreed to a settlement rather than proceed to full litigation, which would have triggered a more thorough public accounting of his financial management over the previous 6 years. Under the terms, the bakery and its assets transferred to me. The house on Callaway Street, minus the outstanding refinancing balance he was now personally liable to repay, transferred to me. His inheritance from the estate was reduced proportionally to reflect the funds that had been redirected. He and Deanna retained what was legitimately theirs. The apron, Patricia noted with the dry humor I had come to appreciate in her, was already mine. The financial crimes inquiry remained open. That part was no longer up to me. I drove to the bakery that evening, let myself in through the back again, the way I had dozens of times as a child, the way I expected to for the rest of my life. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it. The recipe binder on the counter, the aprons on the hooks. The quiet that had settled into the walls over 30 years of early mornings and deliberate work. I turned on the lights above the prep counter and stood in the middle of the room. My grandmother had never said she wanted me to have this. Not in any of the documents my brother had curated, anyway. But she had given me a key when I was 19. She had handed me the good apron when I was 7. She had said, everything I built was built honestly. And she had looked at me the way she always looked at me, not like a placeholder, not like the capable one who wouldn't need it, but like someone she trusted to see what others were too invested to notice. I wasn't sure I was ready to run a bakery. I was certain I was going to try. I found her cardamom loaf recipe near the back of the binder, the page marked with a strip of masking tape that had her handwriting on it. Almost, which was her way of saying she hadn't finished yet, which meant there was still work to do, which was the most like her thing she could possibly have left me. I pulled the apron from the passenger seat where I'd set it before driving over, the one that had been handed to me across the conference table as my inheritance, thin at the front from 30 years of honest use. I put it on over my coat. Then I read through the recipe twice, the way she had taught me, before I touched anything. Outside, the town was doing what it always did in the early evening, quieting down, the streetlights coming on one by one down the block, a few people still moving on the sidewalk, collars up against the autumn cold. Through the front window, the bakery must have looked occupied for the first time in months. A light on, a figure moving inside, something beginning. I measured the flour. I adjusted for altitude the way she always told me to. I worked slowly, without rushing, because the recipe wasn't finished yet, and finished was the only acceptable outcome. She had always said that patience wasn't a limitation. I was finally old enough to understand what she meant. 3 months later, I reopened the bakery on a Thursday morning, which was the day she had always said was the best day for beginnings, far enough from the weekend to feel intentional, close enough to feel like something good was coming. I didn't make a big announcement. I put a small sign in the window the night before and texted the regulars whose numbers I found in her old phone, which I had charged and kept on the counter. By 8 in the morning, the line was out the door. The cardamom loaf sold out in 40 minutes. I had made 3 times what I thought I'd need. I stood at the counter and watched the room fill the way it had always filled, with people who'd been coming here for years, who'd been waiting for the light in the window to come back on. An older man who had been my grandmother's regular Thursday customer stood at the counter and looked around for a moment before his eyes settled on me. He said, "You look like you belong here." I said, "I know." He nodded, satisfied, and ordered the same thing he had ordered every week for 15 years, and I made it exactly right without asking, because she had told me what he liked a long time ago and I had filed it away the same way she had, quietly, carefully, without knowing when it would matter. My brother did not come in. I hadn't expected him to. What surprised me was Deanna. She appeared on the 4th Saturday, alone, and stood near the door for a moment, before approaching the counter with the careful walk of someone who has rehearsed an entrance. She said she had heard the bakery was open again and she just wanted to see. I said it was good to see her and asked what she'd like. She looked at the display case for a long time and then ordered a plain coffee and a scone, and I handed it to her without commentary, and she paid and left without looking back. I don't know what she was looking for. I don't think she knew either. That wasn't my weight to carry anymore. I had learned that lesson in the easiest way possible, which is to say from someone who had already learned it the hard way, over the course of a life lived without the luxury of shortcuts. My grandmother had built this place with patience and honesty and the unglamorous daily discipline of showing up before dawn and making something true from basic materials. She had built it so well that even the people who tried to take it couldn't fully unmake it. The bones were too good. The foundation was too clean. What she left me wasn't $400,000 or a deed or a piece of paper with my name on it. What she left me was proof that the quiet way was also, when the right moment came, the most powerful way. I close the bakery myself every night now. I wipe down the counters and check the ovens and hang the aprons on the hooks by the back door, 3 in a row, the worn one in the center where she always kept it. I turn off the lights from back to front, the way she did, so that the window goes dark last. Some evenings I stand at the front for a moment before I flip the last switch. I look out at the street, at the ordinary Tuesday or Wednesday evening of a small town doing what small towns do, and I think about how little noise any of it required. The documents existed. The truth was already there. I only needed to be the kind of person who knew how to look for it. She made sure I was. The light goes off. I lock the door. I walk to my car in the quiet, which feels earned now in a way it never used to, and I drive home through the streets she drove for 30 years, past the corner where she always turned, thinking about tomorrow's recipe, thinking about what she would have adjusted, thinking about the masking tape note on the cardamom loaf that said almost, which is her voice in my ear every time I mix that particular dough, reminding me that close is not the same as finished, and finished is the only thing worth leaving behind.